At 8:07 a.m., the elevators of Blackstone Meridian Tower opened with the soft chime of polished money and rehearsed authority. People moved through the marble lobby carrying espresso cups, confidential folders, and the quiet arrogance that comes from believing the building itself protects them. Then the CEO's daughter looked at the woman in the gray blazer, smiled without warmth, and said, "You look like the help. Security can escort you out." The woman simply closed her laptop, thanked the receptionist for the coffee, and walked toward the exit. 7 minutes later, 3 phones rang simultaneously inside the executive boardroom. The regulator had frozen the $4.1 billion disclosure process. And suddenly, nobody was smiling anymore. The first thing people noticed about Blackstone Meridian wasn't the height of the tower. It was the silence. Not ordinary silence, expensive silence. The kind created by triple pane glass, imported Italian stone, soundproof executive walls, and employees trained to lower their voices whenever someone important walked past. Even the air conditioning sounded disciplined. At 7:42 a.m., the lobby glowed beneath cascading gold lights that reflected across black marble floors, polished so perfectly they looked wet. Analysts in navy suits crossed the atrium with tablets pressed against their ribs. Assistants carried coffees like ceremonial offerings. Somewhere above the 60th floor, a legal team was already preparing documents connected to the largest acquisition in company history, the $4.1 billion Helix Norvik merger, a deal so sensitive that entire departments communicated in fragments instead of full sentences. Has legal confirmed? Not yet. What about disclosure timing? Waiting on final review. Nobody said more than necessary. In buildings like this, information moved like oxygen, controlled carefully, released strategically, and capable of starting fires if mishandled. And at exactly 7:46 a.m., Elena Vale stepped into the lobby wearing a charcoal gray blazer that looked almost too simple for the room. That was the first mistake people made. They judged the fabric before they understood the woman. No designer logos, no oversized jewelry, no entourage, no performance. Just a slim leather laptop case, low heels that made almost no sound against the marble, and the calm posture of someone entirely comfortable in rooms that made other people nervous. The receptionist glanced up. Name? Elena Vale. The receptionist's expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Recognition. "Oh, they've been expecting you." A nearby junior associate looked over too quickly, before pretending not to stare. Another employee slowed his pace near the elevators. Because inside Blackstone Meridian, almost nobody had met Elena Vale, but everyone had heard the name, mostly in whispers, mostly from legal, mostly followed by sentences that ended abruptly when senior executives entered the room. "That's the woman from the Singapore negotiations. She handled the Rotterdam exposure issue." No, apparently she stopped the Zurich investigation before it became public. "I heard regulators answer her calls directly." Rumors multiplied in corporations the way reflections multiplied in mirrored hallways. Quietly, distorted, dangerously. And Elena walked through all of it without reacting to a single glance. The elevators opened. Floor 71, Executive Operations. The door slid shut behind her with a whisper. Inside the mirrored elevator walls, she finally exhaled once. Not from fear, from fatigue. 3 intercontinental flights in 6 days. 14 hours of disclosure negotiations. 92 pages of regulatory amendments rewritten overnight. And now this, another executive transition meeting. Another corporate family pretending inheritance was a qualification. She rubbed lightly at the corner of one eye as the elevator climbed. Ding. Floor 71. The executive corridor resembled a luxury hotel more than a workplace. Soft lighting hidden beneath dark walnut panels. Abstract artwork worth more than most people's apartments. Glass conference rooms where entire careers could disappear during a 15-minute meeting. Near the center office stood Ava Carlisle, 26 years old, perfect posture, perfect makeup, perfect white suit, the CEO's daughter, officially, Executive Vice President of Strategic Image Management. Unofficially, the reason half the senior staff updated their resumes every quarter. Ava believed confidence and cruelty were the same thing. Worse, she believed humiliation was leadership. She stood beside two assistants reviewing presentation layouts on a tablet, while a stylist adjusted the lighting angle inside the conference room. "Too cold," Ava said. "It washes me out." The stylist immediately apologized. One assistant nodded too quickly. Another typed frantic notes. Nobody questioned her. Nobody ever did. Then Ava looked up and saw Elena. Her eyes paused first on the gray blazer, then the simple leather case, then the absence of visible status symbols. A tiny smile appeared, the dangerous kind. Not emotional, evaluative, like someone deciding whether an object belonged in the room. "You," Ava said casually. Elena stopped. "Yes?" Ava tilted her head slightly. "I thought executive staff were arriving later." "I'm here for the Helix disclosure review." One assistant suddenly looked down at the floor. Another stopped typing entirely. Because the sentence changed the atmosphere immediately. Helix wasn't ordinary business. Helix was the company's future. The merger would redefine market ownership across 3 continents. Investors were already positioning billions around the announcement timeline. Regulatory timing alone could swing valuations by hundreds of millions before lunch. And Ava, unfortunately, hated being corrected by reality. Her smile sharpened. "Oh," she said slowly. "You're with support operations?" Elena blinked once. "No." Ava stepped closer. The corridor became very quiet. "You should know something about this floor," Ava continued. "Presentation matters here. Optics matter. We can't have people wandering executive halls looking like hotel staff." One assistant closed his eyes for half a second. Tiny movement. But Elena noticed. Everyone noticed. Ava folded her arms. "So let's save everyone time. Leave your badge at reception." Silence. Cold, polished, corporate silence. Elena studied Ava for a moment with an expression so neutral, it became impossible to read. Not offended, not angry, almost curious. Like an architect discovering structural damage exactly where she expected it. Then came the sentence. Sharp, clean, public. "You look like the help," Ava said. "You're fired." One of the assistants visibly stopped breathing. Because technically, Ava didn't even have authority over the Helix division. But people like Ava never relied on authority. They relied on fear. And fear had worked beautifully for years inside this building. Elena glanced once toward the glass conference room where legal binders already covered the central table, then toward the skyline beyond the windows. Chicago looked silver beneath the morning clouds, beautiful from a distance, ruthless up close. Without saying another word, Elena calmly placed her laptop case on the nearby console table, opened it, removed a thin black laptop, closed 3 active documents, disconnected 1 encrypted drive, then softly lowered the screen. Click. The sound seemed strangely loud. Ava smirked slightly, assuming victory had arrived faster than expected. "That's better." But Elena only looked at the receptionist assistant standing near the corridor entrance. "Thank you for the coffee earlier," she said warmly. The young woman blinked in confusion. "You're welcome." Then Elena turned and walked toward the elevators. No dramatic speech, no argument, no visible humiliation. And somehow that felt worse. The elevator doors closed behind her. The corridor remained frozen. One assistant finally whispered, "Do you know who that was?" Ava rolled her eyes immediately. "Yes, someone unemployed." But the assistant didn't answer. Because at that exact moment, on floor 68, inside Regulatory Affairs Conference Room B, a compliance attorney named Martin Kessler received an incoming encrypted notification. Priority level crimson. Subject line. Section 17. Disclosure authority. Primary signatory status changed. Martin frowned, opened the file, and felt the blood leave his face. "No," he whispered. Across the room, another attorney looked up. "What happened?" Martin stared at the screen. The Helix disclosure certification. He swallowed once. Was tied to Elena Vale. Silence. Not confusion. Not ordinary concern. The kind of silence that appears 1 second before a skyscraper realizes its foundation just shifted, because without the primary disclosure authority sign-off, the $4.1 billion filing could not legally proceed. And 7 minutes after Elena stepped into the elevator, the regulator halted the process. At 8:14 a.m., panic arrived quietly. Not with shouting, not with alarms, not with dramatic headlines flashing across television screens. Real corporate panic never looked cinematic in the beginning. It looked like executives walking faster than usual while pretending not to. It looked like assistants suddenly whispering into headsets near elevators. It looked like legal teams refreshing the same email every 6 seconds, hoping reality might change itself out of embarrassment. And on floor 71 of Blackstone Meridian, reality had become extremely embarrassing. Martin Kessler entered the executive corridor carrying a tablet so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. He didn't stop at reception, didn't greet anyone, didn't even acknowledge Ava Carlisle standing outside the conference room reviewing lighting options for the investor livestream backdrop. "Where is Elena Vale?" he demanded. The question hit the corridor like dropped glass. Ava slowly turned. "Excuse me?" Martin stared directly at her. "Where is Elena Vale?" Several nearby employees immediately pretended to work while listening to every syllable. Ava gave a small laugh. "The woman from support operations?" Martin's expression didn't move, and that was the moment the temperature changed. Because people in corporations develop instincts around danger, not ethics. Not morality, danger. And Martin suddenly looked like a man watching smoke rise beneath a locked door. "She is not support operations," he said carefully. Ava folded her arms. "Well, she's gone now." Martin blinked once. "Gone?" "She was removed from executive access." "By who?" Ava's jaw tightened slightly. "By me." Silence. Pure, catastrophic silence. One assistant quietly stepped backward. Another lowered his eyes toward the floor, as if avoiding eye contact could erase employment history. Martin inhaled slowly through his nose, then asked the question nobody wanted answered. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Ava's expression hardened instantly. "Oh, I'm sorry," she snapped. "Should I ask permission before cleaning up my own floor now?" Martin looked at her the way surgeons look at x-rays they already know are bad. "The Federal Trade Disclosure Authority froze the Helix filing 6 minutes ago." Nobody moved. Even the air conditioning suddenly sounded louder. Ava gave a dismissive shrug. "So, legal fixes it. That's your department." Martin didn't answer immediately, because the truth sounded too absurd to say quickly. Finally, "We can't." Ava frowned. "What do you mean you can't?" Martin turned the tablet toward her. There, across the screen, glowed a compliance structure chart filled with approval layers, encrypted signatures, and disclosure authority assignments. At the center sat one name, Elena Vale Primary Disclosure Authority, International Review, Certification. Ava stared, then stared longer, because some names carry weight only after they disappear. "That," Ava began slowly, "that can't be right." "Oh, it's right." Another voice entered the corridor, cold, measured, terrifyingly calm. Everyone turned. Richard Carlisle had arrived, CEO of Blackstone Meridian, 62 years old, silver tie, immaculate posture. The kind of man newspapers described as disciplined, strategic, and visionary, because nobody wanted to print the word feared. He walked toward the group with controlled precision, while two senior legal advisors followed behind him, carrying folders and phones ringing nonstop. Richard's eyes locked onto Martin first. Status. Martin answered immediately. Regulatory processing halted under Section 17, pending disclosure recertification. How exposed are we? Investor notice window opens in 51 minutes. One of the legal advisors added quietly, 3 banks are already requesting clarification. Another, and Norvik Capital has paused final authorization. Richard's jaw shifted slightly, barely visible, but devastating, because billion-dollar men didn't show emotion publicly unless the situation was already serious. Then his eyes moved toward Ava. What happened here? Ava straightened immediately. There was confusion regarding personnel access. No, Martin said flatly. There wasn't. Silence again. A dangerous amount of silence. Richard extended his hand toward the tablet. Martin gave it to him. Richard read exactly 3 lines before his expression changed. Tiny movement, almost invisible. But everyone on the floor saw it, because powerful people rarely looked surprised, and Richard Carlyle suddenly looked surprised. Elena was removed? He asked quietly. Ava tried to recover control. She wasn't presenting herself appropriately for executive operations. Nobody informed me she... Richard looked up sharply, and the sentence died in her throat. You terminated the lead disclosure authority attached to a $4.1 billion international merger. His voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. Based on her blazer? No one breathed. Ava opened her mouth again, closed it, opened it again. She looked like... The help? Martin interrupted. The words landed brutally, because now the corridor had witnesses. And witnesses transform mistakes into history. Ava's face lost color. Richard turned away from her immediately. When did Elena leave the building? Approximately 7 minutes ago, an assistant whispered. Richard checked his watch, then finally muttered something that sent a visible chill across the legal team. Call investor relations. One advisor hesitated. What should we tell them? Richard stared through the conference room glass toward the skyline beyond the tower. Clouds had darkened over downtown Chicago. The windows reflected silver against the polished floors like fractured steel. And somewhere beneath the city, Elena Vale was already disappearing into traffic. Tell them, Richard said slowly. The process is temporarily paused. Temporary? Martin asked carefully. Richard looked at him. That single glance contained an entire executive conversation. Can we survive this? Martin answered without speaking. No, because the problem wasn't merely regulatory. The problem was Elena herself. For 5 years, she had become the invisible architecture behind Blackstone Meridian's international compliance strategy. She knew every disclosure vulnerability, every offshore timing risk, every unresolved reporting exposure hidden beneath polished investor presentations. More importantly, regulators trusted her, not the company, her, and trust like that could not be transferred in a conference call. Ava finally stepped forward again. This is being exaggerated. Martin laughed once, short, disbelieving. Then he leaned slightly closer. You think this is about hurt feelings? The corridor stayed frozen. Martin lowered his voice. The regulator halted a multi-billion-dollar filing within 7 minutes of her removal. Do you understand how impossible that is? Nobody answered, because everybody suddenly understood the same terrifying thing. Elena hadn't threatened anyone, hadn't argued, hadn't defended herself. She had simply left. And the system collapsed behind her. A junior analyst hurried from the elevator holding printed market alerts. Sir, he handed the pages to Richard. The CEO scanned them once, then again. Norvik Capital shares were already reacting. Tiny movement, less than 2%. But enough, because markets smell instability the way sharks smell blood. And once they circle, they rarely leave empty-handed. Ava looked around the corridor as if waiting for someone to restore the familiar balance of power. Nobody did, not this time. For the first time since arriving at Blackstone Meridian, she looked young. Not powerful young, unprepared young. Like someone discovering inherited authority works beautifully until it collides with actual competence. Then another phone rang. Martin answered immediately, listened. His face tightened. "What now?" Richard asked. Martin lowered the phone slowly. "The regulator is requesting direct confirmation from Elena Vale personally." The hallway went silent again. But this silence felt different, heavier, longer, like the building itself had realized the woman they mocked on arrival was the only person standing between Blackstone Meridian and public disaster. And somewhere far below the tower, Elena's phone vibrated once inside her bag. She glanced at the screen while stepping into the rain beginning to fall across Chicago. Blackstone Meridian. 14 missed calls. Elena calmly muted the device, then kept walking. If you've ever watched someone powerful mistake arrogance for control, you already know what comes next. Because the most dangerous people in a room are rarely the loudest ones. They're the calm ones, the ones who don't argue, the ones who quietly leave while everyone else is still talking. And sometimes, 7 silent minutes can cost more than 7 years of confidence. Rain turned Chicago silver by 8:31 a.m. The sidewalks below Blackstone Meridian shimmered beneath reflections of traffic lights and towering glass facades, while streams of umbrellas moved through downtown like fragments of dark ink spreading across wet concrete. Elena Vale walked calmly through all of it. No rushing, no dramatic escape, no trembling hands, just steady footsteps and the quiet rhythm of rain tapping against the collar of her charcoal gray coat. Behind her, somewhere 71 floors above the street, an empire was beginning to sweat. Her phone vibrated again, and again, and again. She didn't answer. Blackstone Meridian had spent years treating urgency like currency, weaponizing pressure, deadlines, investor windows, regulatory clocks. Inside the tower, panic always flowed downward toward the people expected to solve impossible problems quietly. Today, for the first time in years, the pressure had nowhere to go. Elena stopped beneath the awning of a small cafe tucked between a law office and a luxury watch boutique. Warm amber light spilled through fogged windows. Inside, people typed on laptops and argued softly over cappuccinos, completely unaware that a multi-billion-dollar merger was balancing on the edge of collapse 3 blocks away. She finally removed the phone from her bag. 23 missed calls, 7 voicemails, 2 encrypted priority requests, and 1 message from Richard Carlisle himself. "Elena, call me immediately." She looked at it for several seconds, then locked the screen again. A young barista behind the counter smiled politely. "Long morning?" Elena returned the faintest smile. "You could say that." "Coffee?" "Black." The cafe smelled like roasted beans, cinnamon, and rain-soaked wool coats. Soft jazz played somewhere overhead, the kind of place executives ignored because nothing expensive happened there publicly, which made it perfect. Elena sat near the window and finally opened her laptop again. The screen illuminated instantly with encrypted dashboards, disclosure timelines, and regulatory correspondence still connected to the Helix Norvik merger. Rows of unresolved flags glowed amber across the interface. Pending disclosures, deferred exposure notices, international timing conflicts, and one file labeled Section 17, Supplemental Review Materials. Elena stared at it silently, then exhaled once, because the real danger inside Blackstone Meridian had never been the merger itself. It was the speed. Richard Carlisle wanted the Helix deal announced before quarter close. Investors expected momentum. Banks expected headlines. Analysts expected market domination. And speed, in corporations, creates blindness. particularly among people rewarded for looking confident. Her fingers hovered briefly over the keyboard, not typing, thinking. Across town, inside Blackstone Meridian, the atmosphere had deteriorated from concern into controlled chaos. Executive assistants moved between offices carrying revised talking points no one believed. Legal teams occupied conference rooms like emergency surgeons trying to stabilize a patient, while executives argued over who caused the bleeding. On floor 71, Ava Carlisle stood alone near the conference room windows, staring at her own reflection. For the first time in years, nobody was trying to impress her. That frightened her more than the regulator. She heard footsteps approaching behind her. Richard Carlisle. Her father stopped several feet away. Not close enough to comfort, not far enough to dismiss. "You embarrass the company," he said quietly. Ava crossed her arms immediately. She overreacted. "No," Richard replied. "You underestimated her. She's an employee." Richard's expression hardened. She was the reason this deal survived Brussels, Singapore, and Zurich without public review. Ava looked away toward the rain sliding down the glass. "You never told me that." Richard gave a cold laugh. "You never asked." The sentence landed harder than shouting would have, because Ava suddenly realized something humiliating. Entire sections of the company operated beyond her understanding, not because information was hidden, because competence had never interested her until now. "You're making this sound catastrophic," she muttered. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed her a printed page. Regulatory exposure summary. She scanned the numbers once, then slower. The color disappeared from her face. Deferred disclosure liabilities, cross-border reporting inconsistencies, conditional investor dependencies, everything legally manageable, but only under precise sequencing. Only if handled correctly. Only if Elena remained attached to the certification process. "That's impossible," Ava whispered. "No," Richard said calmly. "That's corporate law." Silence stretched between them. Outside the conference room, employees avoided eye contact while pretending not to listen, because everyone understood something fundamental about powerful families. The public damage always starts privately. Ava looked back at the paper. "If this becomes public," Richard finished the sentence for her. "Norvik walks." A chill moved through the corridor. Because if Norvik Capital exited the merger publicly, Blackstone Meridian wouldn't just lose the deal. It would signal weakness, and markets punish weakness with religious enthusiasm. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Elena finally opened the Section 17 supplemental review file. Pages of disclosure annotations appeared across the screen. Her own notes, her own warnings, her own recommendations repeatedly marked, "Revisit before final filing." She scrolled slowly, then stopped, one paragraph highlighted in yellow. A deferred compliance discrepancy tied to overseas reporting timing. Minor on paper, potentially catastrophic under public review. Elena leaned back slightly in her chair, because she remembered exactly what Richard Carlisle had said 2 weeks earlier during a midnight conference call from London. "We announce first, clean details later." At the time, half the room had nodded. Investors loved confidence. Banks loved momentum. And executives addicted to growth often confuse acceleration with intelligence. Now the entire structure stood one regulator away from public scrutiny. Her phone vibrated again. This time, Martin Kessler calling. Elena watched the screen for 3 full rings before answering. Martin exhaled audibly in relief. "Elena!" "Good morning, Martin." "That depends entirely on you." She glanced toward the rain outside. "Interesting answer." "Elena, listen carefully. The regulator is demanding direct confirmation before reopening the process." "I assumed they would." "Richard wants a meeting." "Of course he does." "Elena." Martin lowered his voice. "How bad is this?" "Not the merger. Not the delay. This the hidden question beneath all corporate questions. How close are we to disaster? Elena remained silent long enough for Martin's breathing to tighten slightly. Finally, that depends. On what? Whether Blackstone Meridian wants compliance? She looked again at the highlighted disclosure note. Or optics. Martin said nothing, because suddenly the real problem had become visible. The company didn't merely lose a disclosure authority. It lost the only person still willing to slow the machine down before it drove through a legal wall. Elena, Martin asked carefully, are you coming back? Outside, thunder rolled softly above the city. Inside the cafe, someone laughed near the espresso machine. Cups clinked. Rain tapped the windows like impatient fingers. Ordinary life continuing peacefully beside extraordinary corporate collapse. Elena closed the laptop halfway, then gave the only honest answer she had. I haven't decided yet. And back inside Blackstone Meridian Tower, investor calls were already beginning to queue. By 9:02 a.m., Blackstone Meridian no longer felt like a corporation. It felt like an evacuation site disguised as luxury. Phones rang unanswered. Conference room doors opened and closed every 30 seconds. Assistants moved through corridors carrying revised statements that became outdated before reaching the next floor. Somewhere in investor relations, 3 senior analysts were trying to stop financial media from noticing unusual movement surrounding the Helix Norvik announcement window, which unfortunately was already happening. Because markets don't need facts to panic, they only need hesitation. And hesitation was now leaking from Blackstone Meridian like water through cracked glass. Inside Executive Conference Room A, Richard Carlisle stood at the head of a 40-foot walnut table, while 6 department heads spoke over one another in increasingly controlled desperation. We can still delay the filing quietly. No, because Norvik already notified internal stakeholders. If the regulator escalates review status publicly, the banks will freeze transition scheduling. We need Elena back before opening bell. That last sentence finally silenced the room. Richard slowly looked toward the speaker, Daniel Reeve, Chief Financial Officer, a man famous for never sounding emotional about anything. Not layoffs, not acquisitions, not lawsuits. Yet now even Daniel looked strained, which meant the situation had moved beyond uncomfortable and into dangerous. Richard adjusted his cufflinks once. Options. The room stayed silent, because executives love strategy meetings right until reality removes all good strategies. Finally, Martin Kessler spoke. She'll answer to logic, not pressure. One board advisor scoffed quietly. She walked out over an insult. Martin's eyes sharpened instantly. No, he corrected. She walked out because the company just demonstrated exactly how much authority competence actually holds here. Nobody challenged him, because deep down, every person at the table understood he was right. Blackstone Meridian rewarded performance publicly, but rewarded legacy privately. And those two systems had finally collided in full daylight. Daniel leaned forward slightly. How exposed are we if she refuses to return? Martin hesitated, a terrible sign. Then, the Section 17 review file contains deferred disclosures Elena insisted required sequencing before public release. Richard's expression darkened. We already discussed this? Yes, Martin replied carefully. And Elena documented that discussion. Silence, heavy silence, legal silence. The kind that makes executives suddenly interested in exact wording from old meetings. One advisor shifted uncomfortably. You're saying there's written resistance? Martin answered with brutal precision. I'm saying Elena protected herself. Richard walked slowly toward the conference room windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Rain continued sliding across the glass in silver streams. Traffic crawled below. Helicopters crossed the skyline in the distance like mechanical insects. For the first time all morning, he looked tired. Not physically, strategically. because powerful men can survive scandals. What they cannot survive is losing control of the narrative. And Elena Vale now possessed the one thing Blackstone Meridian could not afford: credibility. Behind him, Daniel broke the silence. What does the regulator want specifically? Direct verbal confirmation from Elena regarding sequencing integrity on the Helix disclosures. Richard closed his eyes briefly, just once. But everyone noticed, because in 23 years as CEO, Richard Carlyle had built an empire by controlling timing better than competitors controlled money. And now, timing belonged to someone else. Meanwhile, across town, Elena sat alone near the cafe window while the storm outside intensified. The city had become blurred watercolor beyond the rain. She reread the disclosure file one final time, not searching for mistakes, searching for intention. That was the dangerous thing about corporations. Most disasters aren't created by villains. They're created by intelligent people, slowly convincing themselves that urgency justifies compromise. A young couple entered the cafe laughing while shaking rainwater from their coats. Someone dropped a spoon near the counter. Espresso machines hissed softly in the background. Ordinary sounds. Normal life. Elena almost envied it. Her phone vibrated again. This time, Richard Carlisle calling. She answered after the second ring. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Richard said, "Where are you?" Elena looked out toward the street. "Somewhere quiet." "You halted a $4.1 billion process?" "No," she corrected calmly. "The regulator halted it." "You know exactly what I mean." She stirred her untouched coffee once. The surface reflected cafe lights in distorted amber circles. Richard's voice lowered slightly. "Come back to the tower." Elena smiled faintly. "Interesting. Not an order. A request." That alone revealed how serious things had become. "Why?" she asked. "To resolve this." "Elena." His tone sharpened. "We do not have time for philosophy this morning." Her expression cooled slightly. "And that," she said softly, "has always been the problem." Silence. Richard understood immediately. Because Elena wasn't talking about today. She was talking about years. Years of accelerating filings. Years of compressing compliance timelines. Years of executives treating disclosure law like an obstacle course instead of structural engineering. Finally, Richard exhaled slowly. "What do you want?" There it was, the real question beneath every corporate negotiation. Not morality, not fairness, terms. Elena looked down at the highlighted section 17 annotations on her screen, then toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the cafe windows. "I want the filing delayed," Richard answered instantly. "Impossible." "Then the regulator will eventually discover the sequencing conflict independently. We can manage it internally." "You said that in London?" Another silence. Longer this time. Because truth becomes very uncomfortable when repeated calmly. Richard spoke again, quieter now. "If Norvik loses confidence, the merger collapses." "Elena," he said carefully, "thousands of jobs are attached to this acquisition." Classic executive reframing. Transform risk into responsibility. Make resistance sound selfish. Years ago, it might have worked. But Elena had spent too long watching corporations weaponize urgency against the people cleaning up executive decisions afterward. "You're asking me to certify timing I already flagged as unstable," she replied. "We're asking you to protect the company." "No," Elena said softly. "You're asking me to protect momentum." The sentence landed with surgical precision. Because momentum had become religion inside Blackstone Meridian. Faster growth, faster announcements, faster valuations, and eventually, faster mistakes. Richard's voice became colder. "If this deal fails publicly, the market reaction will be severe." Elena remained calm. "Then perhaps it shouldn't have been rushed privately." Inside the conference room back at Blackstone Meridian, Martin and Daniel watched Richard's side of the call carefully from across the table. They couldn't hear Elena's voice, but they could read Richard's face, and what they saw frightened them. Because Richard Carlyle no longer looked like a CEO negotiating with an employee. He looked like a man realizing the quietest person in the company had documented every warning before the collapse began. Then Richard finally asked the question nobody else had the courage to ask. Elena, if the regulator opens full review... He stopped, didn't finish, didn't need to. Elena understood perfectly. How bad could this become? She looked again at the disclosure file, at the deferred sequencing notes, at the time-stamped recommendations, at the warnings everyone called overly cautious. Then she answered with complete honesty. That depends how many shortcuts your executives forgot I documented. And inside Executive Conference Room A, nobody moved. Because suddenly, the storm outside the tower no longer sounded like rain. It sounded like time running out. At 9:41 a.m., the first leak hit the market. Not a headline, not an article. Just a single sentence buried inside a private institutional investor terminal. Helix Norvik disclosure process, experiencing regulatory delay. That was all it took. Within 90 seconds, analysts began calling assistance. Within 3 minutes, financial journalists started messaging anonymous sources. Within 5 minutes, Blackstone Meridian's internal chat system transformed into digital panic disguised as professionalism. Does anyone have confirmation? Investor Relations says temporary. Temporary how? Legal isn't answering. And somewhere on floor 54, a junior analyst quietly updated his resume during a compliance briefing. Because smart employees always recognize the sound of structural failure before executives do. Inside Executive Conference Room A, the atmosphere had become suffocating. No one touched the catered breakfast arranged along the marble side counter. Espresso sat cooling untouched beside legal binders. Screens across the wall displayed market movement, investor communications, and a terrifying increase in media monitoring alerts. Daniel Reeve checked another update from Investor Relations, then looked up slowly. Norvik requested written reassurance. Martin immediately answered, "We can't provide it without Elena." One board member slammed a pen onto the table. "This is absurd. One compliance officer cannot hold an entire merger hostage." Martin turned toward him with visible exhaustion. "She isn't holding it hostage." "Then what would you call this?" Martin's expression sharpened. "I would call this what happens when corporations confuse replaceable employees with irreplaceable systems." Silence. Because everyone in the room suddenly understood the distinction. Elena had never been important because of title. She was important because the architecture itself trusted her. Regulators, disclosure chains, cross-border approvals, risk sequencing. Entire invisible frameworks had quietly formed around her competence over years of crisis management. And now, Blackstone Meridian was discovering the terrifying reality of modern corporations. The people who actually hold structures together are often treated the worst right before collapse. Richard Carlyle stood motionless near the windows, while downtown Chicago disappeared beneath darker storm clouds. His phone buzzed again, private board line. He answered immediately. "Yes." The voice on the other end spoke for nearly 30 seconds without interruption. Nobody else in the room moved. Finally, Richard replied, "No, the filing is not dead." Pause. "No, this is not a liquidity issue." Longer pause. Then his jaw tightened. "I understand what market perception looks like." He ended the call without another word. Daniel studied him carefully. "The board?" Richard nodded once. "They want contingency language prepared." The room reacted instantly. Because contingency language was executive vocabulary for survival planning. Not confidence, not recovery, survival. One advisor rubbed both hands over his face. "If the press connects this to regulatory sequencing..." "They will." Martin interrupted. Nobody argued. Because financial journalists smell blood faster than investors. And if reporters discovered the merger delay began immediately after the removal of the lead disclosure authority, the story would evolve from market instability into executive incompetence, potentially worse, a governance scandal. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Elena finally finished her coffee. Cold now, bitter, untouched for nearly 20 minutes. Outside, the rain had softened into mist drifting between skyscrapers like smoke. Her laptop remained open before her. Section 17, supplemental review materials glowing silently across the screen. Every timestamp, every recommendation, every warning, preserved perfectly. That was the ironic thing about compliance work. The people ignored during success become extremely important during investigations. Her phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't Richard or Martin. Unknown number. Washington, D.C. Elena watched it ring once, twice, then answered. Ms. Vale, a calm voice said immediately, "This is Deputy Director Warren from the Federal Trade Disclosure Authority." Straight to the point. No corporate politeness. Government regulators rarely waste words during unstable situations. Elena speaking. "We would like clarification regarding the Helix Norvik sequencing review." Of course they would, because regulators develop instincts the same way predators do. And 7-minute collapses attract attention. Deputy Director Warren continued, "Your certification withdrawal triggered automatic escalation protocols." "I'm aware. We'd like to know whether the filing delay is procedural." A slight pause. "Or substantive." There it was, the dangerous distinction. Procedural problems create delays. Substantive problems create investigations. Elena looked out through the cafe window, toward the distant outline of Blackstone Meridian Tower, cutting into the gray sky. Beautiful building. Fragile leadership. Carefully she asked, "Are you requesting an official statement?" "Yes." "And if I decline?" Another brief pause. "Then we proceed independently." Elena closed her eyes for 1 second, because now the situation had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer merely corporate pressure. Now federal timing had entered the room. And once regulators begin asking whether an issue is substantive, executives stop sleeping normally. Back inside Blackstone Meridian, Richard's assistant entered the conference room carrying a printed tablet summary. Her face looked pale. "Sir," Richard took the device, read the screen, then went completely still. Daniel noticed first. "What happened?" Richard handed him the tablet silently. Daniel scanned the message, then muttered one quiet word. "God." Martin stood immediately. "What?" Daniel slowly looked up. "The Federal Trade Disclosure Authority just suspended preliminary acceleration status." The room froze, because acceleration status was the mechanism allowing the merger timeline to move rapidly through disclosure sequencing. Without it, the entire acquisition slowed into standard review exposure. Weeks instead of days. Maybe months. Markets hated months. Investors hated uncertainty. And hostile competitors loved both. One advisor whispered, "How bad does this get?" Nobody answered immediately, because for the first time all morning, nobody actually knew. Then Martin's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and looked directly at Richard. "It's Elena." Every person in the room went silent. Martin answered immediately and activated speaker mode. "Elena." Her voice arrived calm and clear through the conference room speakers. "I spoke with the regulator." No one interrupted. "I informed them the filing requires sequencing review before certification proceeds." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Richard finally spoke. "Elena." But she continued. "And before anyone says this publicly, I did not accuse Blackstone Meridian of fraud, concealment, or misconduct." A visible wave of relief moved through half the room. Then she added, "Because at this moment, I still believe this can be corrected properly." Silence again. Sharp silence. Conditional silence. The kind that contains invisible warnings underneath polite wording. Richard understood immediately. At this moment, meaning the situation still had a direction. For now. Elena, he asked carefully, what do you need? Outside the tower, thunder rolled across Chicago again. Inside the cafe, Elena watched rainwater slide slowly down the glass, while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas, completely unaware that billions of dollars were balancing on a single conversation. Then she finally gave the answer Blackstone Meridian had avoided hearing for years. The truth, she said softly, and enough time to survive it.